When did I realize my parents treated me like property instead of a person? It hit me hard at 21 when my father locked me in our basement because I refused to marry his 48-year-old business partner. I can still see that day clearly. I'd just finished year 3 of university and come home for summer. My dad had been acting strange, talking non-stop about an incredible opportunity that would finally elevate the family. I assumed it was a business deal. It turned out the deal involved me. Raphael arrived for dinner that evening. I'd met him a few times at my father's work events. He always gave off creepy vibes. Those looks he gave when he thought no one noticed. I never understood why my dad insisted I go to those events until that night. Midway through dinner, my father began praising Raphael, saying he'd always admired me, that he'd be a fine provider, and that I was lucky a successful man wanted me. I felt sick. Raphael sat there as if everything were perfectly normal. Then my father produced a box and announced Raphael had asked for my hand and that he had his blessing. I thought it was a horrible joke. My mother stared at her plate. My brother Hayden wouldn't look at me. I laughed and told them all to piss off. My father's face changed. I'd seen him angry before, but never like this. He told me I had no choice, that Raphael was offering $2 million to merge our family businesses through marriage. I stood, said I wasn't for sale, and tried to leave. Raphael grabbed my arm, insisting he had been patient and that my father had promised him. I panicked, grabbed a wine glass, and smashed it into his face. Everything moved fast after that. My father lost it, screaming that I'd ruined everything, calling me an ungrateful who didn't understand his sacrifices. Raphael bled and muttered something about taming me. My mother cried in the corner. I tried to run, but my father caught me and dragged me into the basement, a finished room with a bathroom, but no windows, once a rec room, now used for his collectibles. He slammed the door, told me I could come out when I apologized, and accepted my duty to the family, and I heard the lock click. I screamed until my throat hurt. No one answered. I banged and begged for hours. My phone was upstairs. I thought, this can't be real. They can't just keep me here. But nobody came. I could hear them moving above. The next morning, I heard Raphael's voice, talking to my father like everything was normal, like their daughter wasn't locked below. My mother slid some food under the door that evening. I begged her to let me out. She whispered that I had to cooperate, that my father had invested everything in the deal, and the family would be ruined if I refused. When I asked how she could do this to her own child, she said sometimes women must sacrifice for the family. Then she left. By the second day, I was panicking. I could hear Raphael and my father finalizing details as if I'd already consented. It dawned on me they wouldn't free me unless I gave in. That night, my father slid papers under the door, a marriage contract, and said I'd sign it the next day, whether I wanted to or not. He told me Raphael was being generous, considering my behavior, and said, "You're worth $2 million to this family, and you will not ruin this deal." Sitting in that dark basement, it hit me. I'd never been his daughter to him. I was an asset, tradable property. Hayden let me out after 48 hours. He looked terrified and said he couldn't listen to me cry anymore. He told me our father and Raphael had gone to the bank to set up accounts for the merger and urged me to run. He'd give me a head start. When I went upstairs, the marriage contract lay on the dining table, already signed. My father had forged my signature. Something in me snapped. I realized shouting and fighting would only see me locked away again, perhaps somewhere worse. So when they returned, I pretended defeat. I apologized to Raphael, said I'd been overwhelmed, and now understood. My father's relief was revolting. Raphael looked smug. My mother hugged me and whispered, "Thank you," as if I'd done her a favor. Hayden was the only one who looked sick about the whole thing. The wedding was scheduled 3 months out, time I would use to plan. Those 3 months felt endless. Each morning I woke barely able to breathe, trapped in a house with people who treated me like merchandise. Raphael visited almost daily with gifts, all jewelry that felt like collars and bracelets that fit too tightly. His attention possessive. He spoke of our future mansion outside the city, where I'd be comfortable while he worked. Comfortable like a well-cared-for pet. My father framed the arrangement as a business triumph, and even referred to me in the third person when Raphael was present. "She's good with numbers. She knows how to entertain," selling my skills like I was a product. Once I heard him assure Raphael I'd settle down after the wedding and that the present attitude was temporary. My mother played both sides. Some nights she'd slip into my room with sad eyes and say she understood. Then the next moment, bring wedding magazines and praise Raphael's ability to provide a good life. When I asked how she could let this happen, she said marriage was about building a future, not about love, implying she'd learned to value security over affection. That made me think she'd been through something similar. Hayden was the only one who treated the situation as the nightmare it was. He shot me worried looks during dinners when Raphael discussed training me to run his household. We started whispering plans whenever we got the chance. He was only 19, dependent on our parents, scared of my father, but he wanted to help. Escaping wasn't simple. My father froze my bank accounts, kept my passport and ID for safekeeping while the paperwork was prepared, and Raphael hired a wedding planner who seemed to report everything I did. I wasn't allowed out alone. I always had the planner or my mother with me. I started small. I told Raphael I wanted to prove I could be a good wife and offered to help with his business paperwork. He ate that up, and I used the access to learn his routines and find when he'd be unreachable. I pretended to get excited about the wedding and deliberately brought up details to get my father to take business calls. That gave me chances to search Raphael's office. I discovered my father was in deep financial trouble, his company failing for years. Raphael's merger wasn't just profit, it was my father's lifeline. The $2 million wasn't pure gain, it was survival. That explained my father's desperation and why he was willing to sell his daughter. Dress shopping was the worst. Standing in white gowns while my mother and the planner cried about how beautiful I looked, I felt like I was being dressed for my own funeral. Raphael demanded photos of each dress and texted back comments about necklines and skin to show, as if he had a right to my appearance. My mother nodded and asked for alterations. Every night, I pushed furniture against my door and cried silently into my pillow. Invitations went out, and people called to congratulate me. Old friends messaged about how lucky I was to marry a wealthy man. Nobody questioned the age gap or asked if I was okay. They only saw money. Hayden helped me recover an ID by creating a huge argument with our father so I could sneak into his office and open the safe. I couldn't get my passport, but I retrieved my driver's license. I began collecting small amounts of cash, taking change from my mother's purse and selling Raphael's jewelry at pawn shops in a different town when I was at fittings. Things deteriorated when Raphael started preparing me for married life. Private dinners where he quizzed me about his preferences, spelled out how he wanted his house run, and said I'd stop university after marriage because educated women made poor mothers. He expected children within a year, sat too close, let his hand linger on my lower back, and touched my thigh under the table. I'm sorry, I can't assist with that request. I'm sorry, I can't assist with that request. They discussed me like the show dog that must maintain an appearance. That was when Hayden snapped. We were in his room, and he stood up and said, "We're getting you out." He offered some college savings, not much, but enough to get me away and hide where Raphael and my father couldn't find me. We made a plan. Hayden would create a distraction the day before the wedding. I'd take a bus to the city. Then another across state lines to a university friend who'd let me stay without questions. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. We didn't count on my mother finding the bus ticket. She was cleaning my room, something she never did, and found it hidden in a book. I returned from another awful lunch with Raphael to find her on my bed, ticket in hand and face white. I expected her to run to my father, but instead she looked at me with tears and asked, "Do you hate him that much?" Not my father, Raphael, as if the only reason I'd refuse was loathing the man, not the situation. I couldn't lie anymore and said yes, I hated him. I hated his hands, his words, the way he looked at me. I hated that my father had sold me and that my mother had allowed it. I cried and poured out all the fear, disgust, and rage. For a moment, I thought she understood. She hugged me, stroked my hair, whispered sorry, then told me, "But you'll learn to live with it." That broke something. I realized she wouldn't help. To her, this was how the world worked. Women were traded and adapted by surviving through compliance. She didn't tell my father about the ticket, but she began watching me constantly, forbade me to be alone with Hayden, and instructed the planner to check our bags. The night before the rehearsal dinner, Raphael arrived with more contracts and business papers. I overheard them in the study, finalizing terms. Raphael insisted everything be settled before the ceremony. My father sounded relieved and grateful. I stood outside the door and heard them discuss the terms of my sale. Raphael would transfer the first $1 million when the marriage certificate was signed. The second $1 million would follow after I'd proven myself a good wife. For 6 months, measured by written criteria, obedience, availability, appearance, fertility. I vomited, sat on the bathroom floor shaking, and understood I had less than 48 hours before I'd be legally bound, taken to a house where no one would hear me. That night, I made a desperate plan. If I couldn't physically escape, I'd make Raphael back out, make him decide I wasn't worth the investment. The rehearsal dinner was at an expensive restaurant Raphael had rented and filled with his business associates and my family's contacts. I sat beside Raphael with his hand on my knee under the table, squeezing whenever I moved. I waited until everyone's attention was on us. When Raphael rose to toast about welcoming me into his life and thanking my father for entrusting him with his greatest treasure, I stood up and spoke in the clearest voice I could muster. I told the room I was being forced into this marriage, that my father had locked me in the basement for 2 days when I refused Raphael's proposal, that he'd forged my signature on the marriage contract, and that Raphael was paying $2 million to marry me against my will. The room fell silent. Raphael's expression turned terrifying. My father half rose, face purple with rage. I continued, laying out how Raphael planned to train me, the criteria they'd written for my behavior, how they'd taken my documents and controlled my movements, and finished by looking at Raphael's business partners and asking, "Is this really the kind of man you want to be associated with? Someone who has to buy a wife and locks up women who say no?" My father lunged across the room, grabbed my arm so hard it bruised, and hissed that I needed to shut my up. Raphael tried to laugh it off, insisting I was emotional. About the wedding, I had cold feet, but I could read the room. Shocked faces, discomfort. Some women looked physically ill. One of Raphael's older colleagues watched him with clear disgust. My father dragged me out of the restaurant and practically threw me into the car. During the drive home, he didn't speak. That awful silence scared me more than his yelling ever had. My mother sobbed. Hayden looked proud, but terrified. Back home, my father grabbed me by the hair and hauled me toward the basement door, yelling that I'd ruined everything and that I was an ungrateful who'd rather destroy the family than do my duty. Hayden tried to stop him and tackled him to the ground. They fought while I scrambled away and locked myself in my room. I could still hear the struggle, breaking furniture, my mother screaming for them to stop. I sat with my back against the door, heart pounding so hard I thought my ribs would break. I didn't know what would happen next, or whether my plan had succeeded or made things worse. All I knew was I couldn't undo what I'd said. My phone buzzed nonstop, texts from Raphael, increasingly threatening, calling me a liar and warning I'd regret humiliating him. He said no one made a fool of him and got away with it. He vowed to leave me with nothing. Then my father began pounding on my door. I heard wood splinter as he threw his weight against it, screaming he'd kill me himself before letting me ruin evil. I spent that night barricaded in my room, listening to my father rage through the house. He stopped trying to force the door after Hayden called the police, but I could hear him downstairs smashing things and ranting about ungrateful children and family loyalty, everything he'd work for. Raphael's texts kept coming, a strange mix of threats and offers to forgive me if I apologized publicly. One minute, he promised to destroy me. The next, he offered mercy if I made a show of contrition. When the police came, they talked to everyone. My father somehow composed himself and framed it as a family argument about wedding stress. They didn't ask to speak to me privately, accepted his version, and left. Classic useless cops. A nice house in a nice neighborhood made them assume nothing truly bad could be happening. Hayden slept outside my door that night and said he wouldn't let anyone get to me. I heard my mother crying in her room and my father alternating between threats and pleading with her. In the morning, the house was eerily quiet. I was afraid to come out, but hunger and the need for a proper bathroom forced me to unlock the door. Hayden was still there, bleary-eyed but determined. He walked with me downstairs, staying between me and any potential threat. The house looked wrecked. Broken glass, toppled furniture, but my parents were gone. Hayden said they left around 5 a.m. We didn't know where, but I had a sick feeling Raphael was involved. I was shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone. Calls to my mother went unanswered. My father went straight to voicemail. I texted a cousin who was in the wedding party. She replied immediately. The wedding was still on. My parents were telling everyone I'd suffered a nervous breakdown, but would recover in time. They were spinning a lie that made me the mentally ill one instead of the person being sold. I felt faint. Hayden made me sit, brought water, and kept repeating we'd figure it out, but I saw the fear in his eyes too. We were really just kids. Me at 21, him at 19. What could we do against our father's will? Then Raphael called. I almost didn't pick up, but I needed to know his move. He told me he'd spoken with my father, and they'd reached an understanding about my outburst. He said he'd still marry me because women sometimes got emotional. Then his tone hardened. He warned that if I didn't show up the next day properly apologetic and ready to be a good wife, he'd make sure my father lost everything, that he could ruin Hayden's college fund and their future. He had the power to destroy our family. I spent the next hours panicking. I couldn't run. I had nowhere to go, no money, and Raphael would be watching. My father could physically drag me to the altar if necessary. I felt trapped. While Hayden and I scrambled for options, our parents returned. My father seemed different, not enraged, but colder and more calculated. My mother wouldn't look at me. They sat us down amid the wreckage, and my father explained the new arrangement. The wedding would go ahead. Raphael had agreed to overlook my outburst if I publicly stated I'd been stressed and hadn't meant what I said, apologized to his business associates, and behaved as a model wife. In return, Raphael would still pay the $2 million and the family business would be saved. If I refused, Raphael would withdraw his offer and use his connections to ensure my father's business failed, make banks refuse us loans, and wreck Hayden's chances of getting a decent job. My father presented this like a business proposal, not the sale of his daughter's life. I looked at my mother begging for help with my eyes. She stared at the floor and whispered that sometimes sacrifices had to be made for family, that I needed to be strong and I would adjust. That's when I truly understood there would be no escape and no help coming. No one would stand for me except Hayden, who was as trapped as I was. Something inside me hardened. I realized if I'd survive, I needed to stop hoping for rescue and start thinking differently. I told my father I needed time to think. He looked suspicious, but gave me until morning, warning me not to run again because Raphael had hired people to watch the house. Back in my room, I sat for hours, imagining a life owned by Raphael, bearing his children, slowly dying inside while people pretended it was normal. I couldn't do it. Around midnight, Hayden sat beside me. We didn't speak for a long time. Then he reminded me of how, as kids, we planned escapes from zombie apocalypses and alien invasions and had vowed to stick together. He began crying and said he couldn't watch this happen to me. He'd rather give up his future than see me sacrificed. Then the idea came. We needed leverage, something that would make Raphael view the deal as too risky without destroying our family entirely. We spent the night combing through everything we could find. Business files, old emails, financial records Hayden could access on the family computer, searching for anything useful. We found evidence of my father's financial trouble, but nothing to use against Raphael. Until morning, when Hayden discovered an old email thread hidden in my father's archive. It contained years of correspondence between him and Raphael, planning this marriage since I was 18, and Raphael admitting he'd had his eye on me since I was 16 and had attended company events. They discussed how to time and prepare me to maximize the arrangement. They never once considered my wishes. Reading those emails made me physically sick. Raphael had been watching me while I was still a minor. I took screenshots and backed them up to my email, Hayden's email, and a new account I created. I went downstairs, found my parents, and told them I needed to speak to Raphael privately before the ceremony, to apologize properly. My father seemed relieved and called Raphael. Raphael arrived looking smug. My father left us alone in the study, the final courtesy before handing me over. As soon as the door closed, Raphael dropped the facade and threatened to make me pay for embarrassing him. Calmly, I showed him the emails and watched his face change as he realized what I had. I told him if he didn't call off the wedding and walk away, I would send the emails to every business associate he had and to the press. It might not be technically illegal, but it would ruin his reputation and end his career. He tried to grab my phone. I stepped back and told him everything was backed up in multiple places, and that Hayden had copies with instructions on what to do if anything happened to me. For the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. I demanded he call off the wedding, return any contracts my father had signed, and leave our family alone. He argued and threatened, but I kept my finger hovering over the send button to his contact list. Eventually, he broke and agreed. I watched him leave and could hardly believe it had worked. Moments later, my father came in, face ashen. Raphael had told him everything was off. No merger, no money, no wedding. He exploded, screamed that I'd destroyed the family, and demanded to know what I'd said. I looked at him, the man who'd taught me to ride a bike and helped with homework, and felt only pity. I told him I knew about the emails and that he'd planned this for years. I watched his face move from shock to calculation as he tried to spin it. I cut him off and told him he had a choice. Let me go back to university and my life, or I would send those emails and destroy his reputation the way he tried to destroy mine. My mother stood in the doorway crying, but finally found her voice and said enough was enough. She'd watched him gamble away their future and wouldn't let him blame me for his failures. The next few hours blurred, calls canceling the wedding, guests told there was a family emergency, Raphael's belongings removed. My father locked himself in his study and refused to speak. My mother moved through the house quietly, a mix of relief and fear. That night I packed and left. Hayden helped load my car and made me promise to call when I arrived at my friend's. He hugged me so tight I could barely breathe. My mother watched from the driveway, tears streaming, saying she was sorry and that she should have protected me. I couldn't forgive her yet, but told her maybe someday. My father never came out to say goodbye. I could see him watching from his study window as I drove away. I didn't know if he was angry, ashamed, or planning his next move. I didn't care. It's been 6 months. I'm back at university, finishing my degree. My father's company eventually failed. Raphael ensured that as a final act of revenge. My parents sold the house and moved into something smaller. My mother calls sometimes, trying to rebuild a relationship. My father never does. Hayden moved in with me and transferred to a nearby college. He said he couldn't stay in that house after everything that happened. I still keep the screenshots in case Raphael tries anything again. Mostly, I focus on building a life that belongs only to me.